Hi, I'm Colin Sanders and you're listening to the History Books Review. And in this episode I'm taking a bit of a digression to look at Gibbon's personal relationship with the Roman Empire. Gibbon starts his history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the reign of Augustus, around the turn of the 1st century. I think this was a period that he understood very well. In fact, I'd say he had insight into the setup of the empire much keener than we do today. There were many parallels with his own time. Gibbon's Britain was a constitutional monarchy. It was run by a king and a parliament. The parliament was an assembly of the rich and powerful members of society. The comparison between the emperor and the Senate is obvious. Gibbon was himself a member of the British Parliament, so he must have had a pretty good idea of what it was to be a senator. There was the very obvious difference that under the Caesars the Senate was the junior partner in government. But that did not make the Senate impotent. Gibbon would have known very well that running a state took an awful lot of personal contacts, deal-making and trading of personal favours. Just as the king was a lot more than a simple figurehead in Gibbon's time, the Senate was far from a simple talking shop. The court of George II was a major clearinghouse for the activities of the upper classes, and the king himself had led his troops into battle. Basically, the king needed a parliament, and the parliament needed a king, and the emperor needed a senate, and the senate needed an emperor. This is something Gibbon would have had direct personal experience of. We will never be able to understand it in the instinctive way that Gibbon was able to. There are issues that are obviously close to the heart of Edward Gibbon MP, and we see this in particular in his attitude towards the army. Although in Britain Parliament had succeeded in taking effective control of the state, you only had to look across the Channel to France to see how easily things could have turned out very differently. The Bourbons had managed to establish an autocratic regime basically by getting control of the army, and this was exactly the way the emperors had done just the same thing. The British were always suspicious of a standing army for exactly that reason. They were worried that it would be used to crush the liberties of the citizens. By modern standards, neither 18th century Britain nor Imperial Rome would count as functioning democracies. But they weren't totally despotic either. Both maintained the rule of law in theory and to some extent in practice. Government wasn't tremendously representative, but neither was it totally arbitrary. This was all good news for property owners and even better news for lawyers. Gibbon's world was in some ways more technically advanced. It had printing presses, gunpowder, advanced scientific instruments and mechanical clocks. Gibbon also remarks how what he calls the plenty of glass and linen has brought real benefits to all the nations of Europe. These were early fruits of what was soon to come in the Industrial Revolution. It's easy to forget what a boon to living standards cheap glass is. It means you can easily store food and drink, and transport it if you wish. Large windows allow light and airy rooms without the wind blowing through them. The Romans had glass, of course, but it was very expensive, and using it for windows was considered a great extravagance. But although Gibbon's time was ahead in many respects, the Romans were still the most sophisticated civilization that had ever existed on the continent of Europe. Nothing demonstrates this better than transport. Gibbon would have found it impossible to move around Britain any faster than a Roman legion, and in some parts would have found it hard to get around at all. The network of roads crossing the continent and available to the emperors would not be beaten until the advent of the railways in the 19th century. This was obviously impressive and convenient, but it also meant that a huge free trade area had been created, stretching from the walls in Scotland to the banks of the Euphrates. goods would not be able to travel so freely and easily over such a wide area until the expansion of the European Union in the 1970s. Enterprising Romans could, and did, create goods that could be sold on an empire-wide basis. And they could become rich in the process. They could then move to a town to enjoy the fruits of their labour. And there they'd find plenty of goods produced by others to spend their money on. It's possible to argue that the degree of urbanisation was greater in the Roman Empire than it was in Gibbon's Britain, and Britain was one of the most urbanised parts of Europe at the time. The consensus is that the population of Rome peaked somewhere around 1 million. London would not reach that figure until the early years of the 19th century. There's a lot more to a city than just lots of people living together. Civil engineering is key to keeping everybody supplied with the necessities of life, in particular, water. The very word aqueduct always brings Roman engineering to mind. Roman plumbing was equally impressive and was probably superior to what Gibbon had to put up with. Cities and towns also have to be fed. 18th century Britain and Rome were both predominantly agricultural societies. The bulk of the population had to live in the countryside, devoting most of their lives to the production of food. Tools had developed, and plant and animal varieties had improved, and the science of agriculture had made many advances. So the productivity of farmland had increased. But without the pesticides and fertilisers available from the 20th century onwards, it was impossible to radically increase productivity. So the basic structure of society hadn't changed. Writers and thinkers and men of letters like Gibbon were still rare, just as they had been during the Empire. This is illustrated by the way Gibbon praises his own personal favourite historian, Tacitus. Gibbon believes that Tacitus will continue to be read for as long as history is read. Well, he might be right there, but I don't think we can be as confident. It flows from the assumption that good content will always be in short supply, because writers will always be rare. Gibbon could have had no idea of just how many historians were going to follow him and just how many pieces of writing there are now to choose from. Gibbon had some 6,000 classical texts in the library where he worked, and it was his intimate knowledge of them that enabled him to write Decline and Fall. It's hard to think of any area of human knowledge nowadays where you could fit the whole thing into a room anymore. But I think it's interesting that as the history of the empire progresses, Gibbon sort of loses his alignment with it. He tends to describe it in terms of the empire declining, but in some ways it's simply changing into a form that Gibbon can no longer understand. The biggest break comes at around the reign of Diocletian. He was the first emperor who dispensed with using the trappings of the Republic to confer legitimacy. Instead, he switches to endorsement by the gods. Constantine took this a step further by explicitly ruling on the basis of being God's chosen appointee. When he considered these developments, Gibbon had no comparison to draw on. But I think we can find one that he couldn't. It seems to me that the late period of the Empire comes to pretty closely resemble the mid-period of the Soviet Union. Both were primarily agricultural, autocratic states. They were both capable of generating some impressive projects, but they were only afforded by squeezing more and more out of basically very poor people. The trick was to combine highly repressive measures, including secret police and armed guards, with an all-embracing ideology. Communism in one case, Christianity in the other. Both states tried to control a wide range of people's behaviour. The attempts to manage the economy were the most disastrous. Diocletian famously tried to control prices by edict. The Soviet Union's Gosplan department laid down 5-year economic plans telling people how the Soviet Union was going to develop. Both states were run by elites who owed their position solely to the government. In Russia, it was the party. Constantine actually appointed patricians. This was a throwback to the patricians of the Republic, who had been an hereditary aristocracy. But Constantine's patricians were appointed for their own life only and couldn't hand the title on to their descendants. In both cases, the effect was to increase the power and influence of central government against any other initiatives. The other similarity is that both states collapsed. The Soviet Union lasted for about 70 years. The late Roman Empire period that I'm talking about is a bit better, lasted about 100 years. I have a feeling that the reason that both states collapsed was the same, and that it was that the people in charge simply lost the ability to operate all the levers they'd so enthusiastically gathered under their own control. I think this fits better than the idea that they were destroyed by an external or an internally generated crisis. It's certainly true that when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was in a state of bankruptcy and crisis. But it had always been in a state of bankruptcy and crisis. That was normal for the Soviet Union. Likewise, the Roman Empire was beset by barbarian attacks, but it had always been surrounded by barbarians. In the end, they were both a bit like a dead fish. They rotted from the brain. Thanks for listening to this episode of the History Books Review. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm afraid it was a bit of a rush and I've had to extemporise quite a bit of it straight off the top of my head. But I have noticed that my listening figures are going up. I'm getting more people downloading it, which makes me feel rather humble and a bit worried. It really would be very tragic to have to give up now, so I will struggle to keep on going as long as I can. And please bear with some of the quality being a bit on the rough side. In the meantime, thanks for listening.